My name really is John Root. It's not just a stage name. And this is Edible Perennial Gardening and Landscaping, courtesy of the library and the Garden Club, I believe, is co-sponsoring. So I'm wondering, how many of you feel that you have a green thumb? Not particularly? Do you think you don't have a green thumb?
I don't think I do.
Well, I hope to convince you that you do by the end of this presentation. I'm going to give you virtually fail-safe instructions on how to grow your plants well and have them thrive. First, let's talk about organic gardening. It's working in harmony with natural systems, and whatever you take out, you put back. So, when you harvest the produce, you want to replenish your soil with nutrients. And the benefits of organic gardening are the plants are more vigorous, and the produce that they give us is safer and tastier and more nutritious. And you also save time and money. So permaculture, here's a word that you might not have heard about. It's a combination of permanent and agriculture, or some people think it's permanent and culture, but whatever it is, it's all about sustainability and creating what we need. So much of what we need comes from plants, actually. Food, fiber, energy can all come from plants. And if we design our landscapes to mimic the relationships of nature, then we won't have to work so hard, hopefully, and we won't need to have so many inputs. And Bill Mollison thinks of it as encompassing just about every kind of culture, including architecture, ecology, money management, and community design. All of that in his mind is permaculture. But basically, permaculture for us today is about edible landscaping, and that's primarily landscaping with perennials, not annuals. There's nothing wrong with those annuals. I love them too. But I want to give you ideas of how to landscape so that you can keep on harvesting every year and you don't have to keep on replanting. And of course, these wonderful perennials make copies of themselves. You can have more and more each year. So here's a fellow who took a corn farm and transformed it to a small permaculture situation where he's growing chestnut, hazelnut fruit trees, a variety of other fruits and vegetables, and he has a number of animals as well. But you can do this on a smaller scale. This is almost a postage stamp size lawn, isn't it? Which typically would have grass and maybe a couple of ornamentals, but look at what someone did with that. And isn't it beautiful, for one thing? Functionally effective. There's a lot of diversity there, many different kinds of plants. Not all of them will be edible. Some of them will be serving the edible plants, if you will. They might be pollinators, for example, plants that bring beneficial insects in. They might be nitrogen fixers, which help to nourish the soil with nitrogen. And so what you have here then with perennials, you have a prolonged harvest. You can be harvesting now if you have, for example, walking onions or spring onions. These things have just been waiting until warm weather, and here's the warm weather, and they're heading for the sky. They're doing quite well. So when people who have annual gardens are just kind of starting to put things in, here we could already be harvesting if we have a perennial oriented garden. And also at the other end of the calendar, or at the other end of the season rather, we have fall ripening fruits, which are pawpaw and persimmon and hardy kiwi. All of these things which may not be that familiar to you, but they're wonderfully nutritious, they're delicious, and these are all possible ways to extend our harvest. And of course, we'll have a wider spectrum of taste and nutrients from these plants. And one wonderful thing about perennials is that they stand up well to challenging weather conditions, drought, for example, when other plants in your annual bed might be needing a lot of coddling and watering and that sort of thing. They do quite well. They know how to take care of themselves pretty well, especially after they've gotten through the first few years of their life. They can be tremendously productive, and they can provide wildlife habitat and ideally They take less labor and resources than your annual vegetable garden. Now, it might be a higher upfront cost. You might have to spend a significant amount of money, depending on what scale you're thinking about, to invest in those plants. But once you have them in the ground, what a wonderful investment. Not only will they be giving you, when they reach maturity, significant amounts of produce, but they'll make copies of themselves, many of them. And you can propagate them and then be generous and give them to your friends and family, or you can just have more for yourself, or a combination of the above. So ideally, these require much less labor and resources than annual vegetable gardens where you have to start from scratch every year. Now, here we have a couple of people who call themselves plant geeks. Here's Jonathan. This is Eric Tonesmeyer, the author of the book, and his partner Jonathan, and the two of them bought a duplex in Holyoke and started out with virtually nothing growing there, and they transformed it into this paradise lot in Holyoke. And as you can see, it's a romantic story, because when they bought it, they were bachelors, and now look at them. So, and this is the house that they bought. Now look at this, just a little patch of, well, what you can't even imagine that's going to be a garden, right? But what they did was, they did what's called sheet mulching, and I'll get to that in a minute, how you manage that. But basically, it's just a lot of organic matter that you put down, and then you trust that the earthworms, your allies, the earthworm is your plow. The earthworms will help create that, create a wonderful garden bed there. And look at the lush vegetation growing in that place where there was just compacted earth previously. And that's their backyard. And people come from all over the country to visit their backyard and learn from them. And not all these plants are edible, by the way. There might be, as I indicated, some plants are helpers of the edible plants, the pollinators and the nitrogen-fixing plants and that sort of thing. So, I mentioned sheet mulching. Are any of you familiar with the sheet mulching? Okay. The idea is, now it doesn't have to be on a large scale like this. This is an awful lot of land being covered. But the idea is, you want to create a garden, you don't have to till. All you have to do is put down layers of stuff. So you start by giving the lawn a haircut, scalp it. Or if it's weeds, just cut it back. And then soak it. And you can leave all that vegetation right there. It's going to become part of your compost, right? And then you cover it with cardboard, or newspaper works well. 6 thicknesses of newspaper is fine. And you have them overlapping each other so no weeds can get through. Soak that. And then you add layers of whatever you have that's organic. So, for example, here's a typical, and this is why it's called lasagna gardening, right? It's layers of organic matter. This is pretty ambitious. You may not need to have, or you may not be able to find this much organic matter, but the compost is a great idea. And on top of that, that's why it's called sheet mulching, you want a layer of mulch to keep the summer sun from baking the soil, to keep the weeds out, allow it to receive plenty of moisture and retain moisture. So here are the benefits of sheet mulching. Keeps back the weeds, it's less labor and time, improves the nutrient and water retention. The worms and the other microbes are so delighted with it, it's just perfect conditions for them, all this wonderful decomposing matter. And therefore the soil structure is improved by their actions. And that in turn improves plant vigor and health. When you're growing plants, you're really growing soil. If you're growing this, if you're doing a good job feeding the worms, the microbes, everything else, the plants will take care of themselves almost. So now here's a fellow, Sepp Holzer, an Austrian farmer. He figured out that if he just buried logs and branches and that sort of thing, this is a cross-section of this hill culture that he's talking about, you can see that heat rises, okay, it's decomposing, so he was able to grow a lot of vegetables that he wouldn't otherwise be able to grow in his zone. And also he discovered that he didn't have to water, because it's just like a sponge in there that just holds so much water inside this hill. So this is a kind of a unique approach, all right, to, this is a different kind, shall we say, of sheet mulching that, if you have layers of different things, the turf, if you cut the turf, just put it upside down, but it doesn't need turf. These are just possibilities. You could just, if you had a lot of compost, that would probably be ideal. And then you cover it with a layer of mulch and then plant whatever you want. This could be for annuals or perennials. We have far too much of this stuff called turf. We grow more turf in America than any other crop. And we put far too much chemicals on it. I'm not opposed to all lawns, certainly, but there's no reason why we need to apply either chemical fertilizers or herbicides and pesticides to our lawns, because they're natural ways to take care of lawns. The costs of lawns, there they are. I'm not going to even bother reading them to you, because you can see for yourself it's just way too much of an impact both to the environment and to our pocketbook. $1,200 on the average is spent annually on lawn care per household. That's staggering. Think of what you can do with that money. In a decade, you'd have $10,000 to do something else. And again, the negative impacts of lawns. Here's a choice. You could establish a wildflower meadow. Now, I'm not going to pretend that that's an easy thing to do. It would require an upfront investment. You'd probably need to hire some expertise, because it's a delicate balance of plants, and then there'll be a succession happening where you get different plants coming in to replace the ones before. But still, you could save a lot of if you have a large lawn, you could make a wildflower meadow instead and save a lot of time and money. But here we're going back now to our topic of edible perennials. And in this case, the sheet mulching that we talked about, you can see that the lawn has been covered with cardboard. But before they even do the lasagna approach, before they add the organics, you can go ahead and put the plants in and then fill in around the plants. That's one approach. I hope that these folks in this illustration, in this photo, I hope they've done their homework and realize how big some of these plants are going to get at maturity, because that's one of the most common mistakes that people make, is not accounting for how big the plants will be at full size. You don't want the plants crowding each other or overlapping. You almost can't get enough compost, and you might even consider getting a truckload of the stuff, what gardeners call black gold. What's it good for? Just about everything. It feeds the soil life, and again, soil life is where it's at in terms of nutrition and making plants happy. It increases water retention, drought tolerance, buffers the soil pH. If you've got soil that's either too acidic or basic, add compost. It solves either problem. It improves the texture of the soil. It produces humus, suppresses weeds, and it boosts yields. So you want to create compost, perhaps. And here's the formula. You want equal amounts by weight of high carbon and high nitrogen materials. But it turns out to 3 or 4 times the amount of browns to greens if you're looking at volume, because many of those take up a lot of space, like the leaves and or paper or cardboard, compared to how much these things weigh, your vegetable scraps and fruit scraps and the like. So notice the greens aren't all green, but what this green means is high nitrogen and fresh plant matter, or fresh organic matter, including grass clippings, trimmings from plants, weeds. All these things are good for high nitrogen parts of your compost pile. And then you balance them then with drier or older, in many cases, dead woody plant tissue. So fall leaves are good. Pine needles aren't great for compost piles because they take so long to decompose. But these other things are fine. And you think about a lot of paper and cardboard that's not recyclable, it belongs in your compost pile. If it can't be, in fact, everything that's organic, if it can't be recyclable, it belongs in your compost pile. So here's an ideal compost bin. It has 2 compartments. One of them is for your first batch, And if it's still working, well, you can get started on this one while that one is being completed. And there's a lot of room here for you to turn the compost, which helps it to mature. Notice it also has a piece of plywood to protect it from the intense sun during the day, or to protect it from torrential rains, which would make it saturated. It's also pretty darn cheap. Pallets can be had, usually for free. Now, here's one that's just leaves, and it's a pretty large amount of leaves there. It takes a long time for leaves to become leaf mold or compost, years probably. That's because you're not providing any of the greens, any of the high nitrogen materials. However, it will become compost eventually, and the worms will love it. How many of you are familiar with this plant called comfrey? Okay, I call it the green manure, because this plant, which is very vigorous and almost impossible to get rid of once it has a hold in your garden, because it is a perennial. But if you have a bed of comfrey, or if you plant comfrey under your fruit trees in your orchard, for example, if you have an orchard, they mine the minerals. Compare the nutrition that's available in comfrey leaves. Here's the nitrogen, here's the phosphorus, here's the potassium. Compare those figures to manure, and you'll see that it far outshines dairy, horse, sheep manure. It's better than chicken manure with a phosphorus and potassium, or phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium rather, and pretty darn good with the phosphorus as well. And it has far more potassium than any of these manures. So the approach here is chop and drop. If you have a good stand of comfrey, you just chop all the leaves and bring them where you want. They can be used as a kind of added to your mulch, for example. You could put them in the compost pile as a nitrogen-rich substance. It would be a compost starter because there's so much good stuff in there. And then they'll keep coming back. 2 or 3 times a year you can do chop and drop. If they're under your fruit trees, well, just leave them there if they're not needed elsewhere, and that'll be really good nutrition for the trees.
How do you start it?
Well, you have to get yourself some comfrey and then put it in the ground and stand back, because it'll take over. You don't want to put it anywhere near your annuals, because then you'll have to figure out how to get rid of it. So keep it off to the side, or as I say, under your perennial plantings. It's a good source of nutrients. It's called a rich weed, and stinging nettle is another rich weed. In fact, I have some in the trunk of my car if someone wants to go home with it. And you might think it's kind of crazy to plant stinging nettle, but I'll tell you, this is one of my favorite foods, for one thing. It's been rated as the world's best land plant food, for that matter. You can't get any better than that, can you? Just for the nourishment and the taste, both, of stinging nettle leaves. Now, how in the world can you eat stinging nettle? Well, by cooking it is the short answer. I just put it in my stir fry, because I figure I don't lose very many minerals that way. I'm not boiling or even steaming. You can also dry nettle leaves and make nettle tea, which is very very helpful. And well, for example, if you have allergies, nettle tea is an excellent way to heal that, to treat your allergies. So nettle or comfrey can both be used to make a tea that can be an organic fertilizer, or it can even be used as a foliar spray, because leaves can actually absorb water and nutrients in some ways even better than roots can, because they absorb it a lot quicker. So there it is, nettle tea, comfrey tea. This is a kind of a creative way to add fertility to your soil. Mulch, what does it do? It keeps the garden from getting too hot, right? There's a protective layer of organic matter, so it keeps moisture in, keeps the heat out. It keeps weeds from coming up, because they don't have a chance, they're covered by the mulch. And it keeps those microbes happy, the soil microorganisms. So here's some types of mulch that you might want to consider. Compost is not great because as a long-term mulch, because certainly any weed seeds that come in, either on the wind or being transported by birds, will be happy to flourish in compost. So eventually you're going to want to cover compost with something else, but it makes a great temporary mulch. Grass clippings, straw, shredded leaves or leaf mold. Pine straw is another good mulch. By the way, some people think that pine straw makes your soil acidic. That's not true. In fact, it's often suggested if you want acidic soil under your blueberries, blueberries like acid soil, put pine needles under that. Well, pine needles will be a great mulch for your blueberry plants, but they won't make it acidic. The only thing that I know of to make soil more acidic is elemental sulfur. So pine straw, like anything else, becomes compost eventually, and is a good mulch because it takes so long to decompose. Pine bark, sawdust, wood chips, shredded hardwood. These substances are high carbon. So what you don't want to do is mix them in with the soil. You get something like nitrogen robbery happening. What that means is that the microbes that are in the soil will do their best to decompose those high carbon products from wood, but they'll also grab whatever nitrogen is they can find in the soil in order to get their balanced diet, and that nitrogen then won't be available to the plants. So they're okay for mulch as long as you don't mix them in with the soil, and that way which would produce fertility problems for the plants. Chip branch wood, I'll explain that in a minute. It's an excellent mulch. And ground covers, you can think of them as a living mulch. So here's what yeah.
What hay? We put that in the
Now, straw, yes, hay, no. The problem with hay is it has seeds. So that's why straw is on the list, but hay is not. Okay. So if you see landscapers using this chipper, and if you see that what they're putting in that chipper is mostly hardwood and mostly small diameter, very small branches, twigs, that sort of thing, ask them if they'd like to dump it at your house, and tell them that they can do that for free. They don't have to cart it miles and miles away. You will allow them to dump it at your house, and what you'll be getting is this fantastic mulch. I mean, it imitates nature, basically. Remember, this is what permaculture is all about, is we're trying to mimic the relationships and the dynamics found in nature. And what's on the forest floor? Twigs, leaves, right? This kind of balanced diet of carbon and nitrogen. So this is a wonderful mulch that adds to your soil fertility. When you look at this, how can you tell if it's soil or dirt? It used to be... soil used to be called in good heart. Whether the farmers were aware of this or not, it was all about the soil microbes in there. It's dirt if there's nothing alive. Dirt is inert, but soil has a lot of bacteria, fungi, etc. Okay, 1 billion bacteria, several yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, which you remember from your biology class, right? Scores of nematodes, these small, invisible, microscopic worms. And all that is good for your soil. All that is good for your plants. Here's a simplified version of the soil food web, and you'll see that organic matter is what begins it all. The dying parts of plants and the wastes of animals and the bodies of animals all contribute to organic matter, which then is digested by the fungi, by the bacteria, and then they in turn are digested by the nematodes and the higher order plants, the higher order animals rather. And you want to be mimicking these patterns of nature in your garden. Here's a big word to learn. Mycorrhizal has a strange spelling, 2 R's in there, and then followed by an H. Who ever heard of such a word? Myco means fungus. Like the study of a fungus is mycology, and rhizal means root. So what this is the fungus root fungi. It's a symbiosis. What is this fungus doing? The hyphae are actually penetrating the root, sometimes even penetrating the very cells of the root. And you would think that would be an infection, wouldn't you? However, the plant wants this fungus to do just that, because the fungus is delivering water and dissolved nutrients like nobody's business. The roots themselves just don't have that much of a network to absorb that much water and nutrients without the fungi. So the fungi can give them a much more extensive network of water and nutrient absorption, just what the root needs, and the root is more than happy to give that fungus in exchange some of the sugars that it manufactures. In fact, the root actually leaks sugar into the soil and attracts these microbes to the rhizosphere. So now that you're convinced that mycorrhizal fungi are a good thing for your garden, for all these reasons, you want to encourage them. And you don't want to then fertilize with a phosphorus-rich amendment such as manure. Minimize digging, and we'll talk about, and of course you don't want to be digging in your perennial bed anyway. Grow a diverse mix of plants. These instructions, rotate and overwintering and lightening up on weed control, those apply more for annual beds than for perennial beds. But it's good to think about what's happening underneath our feet.
What do you mean by plant and overwintering cover crop?
Yes, so these are more for if you have an annual garden. Instead of just leaving the land bare, or even just putting a mulch is better than leaving it bare. But one way to do that then is a cover crop, which you can think of as a living mulch. That's one way to add fertility and protect the soil microbes from the extremes of weather.
And what material would you use for that?
You're asking about the cover crop?
Yeah.
Go to and again, this is not so much for the perennial gardening. And by the way, I'm having trouble again advancing the slide. Wait a minute. Oh, I think she went down. Now I'm not sure what I can do here. Okay. There's more than one way to do this. All right, so go to organicgardening.com if you want to learn about cover crops. In fact, if you want to learn about virtually anything, go to organicgardening.com, especially for those annual vegetable gardens. Sure. Soil texture, but you want to avoid poison ivy, of course. So jewelweed or touch-me-not is one of the plants that you can find that will heal your poison ivy itch if you run into it. So these are some considerations if you don't know where you want your garden site to be. Site selection, you'd think about sunlight, at least 6 hours a day is optimal. Terrain, you want to fill in standing water if there is some, or you can use that hill culture technique that I mentioned earlier, just pile a bunch of logs on there and then the rest of some more organic matter. Oriented to the sun is preferable for slope. And now let's look at air and wind for a minute. You want an open area, but not so open that it's too windy. So there's kind of a happy medium there. And you don't want to have an area where there's going to be a lot of traffic, but you do want to have easy access to your plot. Soil compaction can be a problem. You want water and air to be able to enter your soil. So here are the benefits of no-till gardening, and I want to emphasize that tilling is not the answer to soil compaction. So there's less labor, soil microbes thrive, conservation of soil organic matter, and conservation of moisture. Here's one way to deal with the soil compaction problem. Grow this wonderful vegetable called the Daikon radish. It's like a huge carrot, much longer and thicker than a carrot would be. Doesn't taste like a normal radish at all. Yes?
One of those prior slides have how you can test if your soil is...
Oh yes, testing for soil texture. Again, go to organicgardening.com if you want to have the instructions for that. The aeration happens when these wonderful vegetables grow. They kind of drill large holes in the soil for you. Gardening should be fun, not drudgery. This is an ad for a rototiller and promoting a rototiller, but I consider rototiller itself to be drudgery. And anyway, no-till gardening really is what you want to be doing. The whole sheet mulching approach is no-till. Now let's talk about trees. They have so many advantages, so many things that they do for us. And on your property, you might think about, in particular, if you don't already have a shade tree cooling your house in the summer, or if you don't have coniferous trees, evergreens, to the north of your property breaking, blocking the north winds in the winter, well, you could be saving money with those trees. And speaking of money, property values. If your property is well landscaped, it could be worth thousands of dollars and be a significant, a wonderful investment in your time and money to do that. Here's even more advantages of trees. So you can just glance down that list and think about all the things that you appreciate that trees are beneficial for. Now you've decided what tree or shrub you want to plant. And the idea is to dig a hole that's no wider, or rather no deeper than necessary, but it's actually wider than you might think is necessary, maybe 3 times as wide. And you want to set that plant in the middle and then fill in around it, but don't be tempted to add compost, thinking, oh, compost would be wonderful, the soil microbes and the roots would really flourish. Because while that's true to a certain extent, the roots would love it and they would grow, for starters, they would do pretty well, but then they would not be motivated to go beyond the hole. And you want those roots to be moving past the hole and going into the soil beyond. So just put back the soil that you took out and then cover it with, and you notice here in this cross section there's a little lip of soil that's been created when you put the soil back in, so that it's almost like a bowl, and when it rains or when you're watering the plant, the water stays in that area. And mulch that entire area, but don't put the mulch or dirt around the trunk itself, because that makes the trunk vulnerable to diseases. And that's why you're not wanting to dig the hole any deeper than absolutely necessary, because it might settle if you dig it too deep, and then the trunk would be vulnerable to those diseases in the soil. Now, with some other things to think about with mulch, avoid coarsely textured mulches, because the weeds come up and it's kind of unsightly anyway. 7 inches of mulch, that's much too much, apart from the fact that this mulch is right against the trunk. So there are 2 mistakes here. And don't pile mulch against the tree bark. Professionals do this. But why do they do it? Right. Don't they understand that, they certainly don't want roots to be growing out of the trunk, do they? That's kind of what you're encouraging the tree to do. So here's a better idea. Leave a circle, a patch of soil around the tree that's not mulched, and then mulch, consider at least to the drip line, even beyond, because the tree roots will certainly be going beyond that drip line in search of moisture and nutrients. Now, the first tree that I'd like to talk about is the Chinese chestnut. What a wonderful tree it is. It's a medium-sized to tall tree, but it's nowhere near as tall as the American chestnut used to be when it was the sequoia of the East. It's a really magnificent tree. And yet it has nuts that are larger than American chestnuts and quite tasty. And look at this yield. 5 to 7 years, you've got 35 to 55 pounds of nuts each year. So if you want to harvest chestnuts, you need to have at least 2 for cross-pollination, and you also need to have a plan about what to do with the squirrels, because they also love them. And one idea that I've heard is that you can knock the nuts out of the tree before they're quite ripe and then bring them indoors so the squirrels don't have a chance. I don't suggest that you plant a black walnut tree on your property, even though it is an edible nut, because it's just so darn big. It takes up too much space. And the other thing about it is that the roots of this tree conduct chemical warfare. It's called allelopathy. And there are some other trees that do this too. Norway maple, sycamore maple, tree of heaven, all of these will inhibit the growth of other plants near them. And what we want to be doing with our edible forest gardens, which is what people in permaculture call them, we want different levels of plants that are actually encouraging each other rather than inhibiting each other. Heartnut, Japanese walnut, is a good choice, however, because it does not have that allelopathy, and it's it's only 20 to 30 feet tall, which is perhaps a quarter of the height the black walnut will get. Sweet nuts ripen in September. So it's interesting to think about these nuts, many of which we've never even heard of or tasted. But again, this is an oriental species, and if you realize that in the Orient, in many parts of the East, the climate is very similar to ours, right? It's a temperate climate. They have cold winters, hot summers. So if it grows there, most likely it will grow here. And there are no problems of invasiveness with any of these species. Hardy almond. Think about growing almonds in Massachusetts. Isn't that a unique idea? And there are different varieties that will do fine. And isn't this a wonderfully ornamental tree? It's a relative of the peach tree, so it's just as beautiful as a peach is, and about the same size and shape. Korean nut pine. This is the nut that you pay $30 a pound for if you go to a store. Now, however, you need patience to grow. If you're thinking about harvesting from the Korean nut pine, it takes many years for it to get to a significant size, but it keeps growing and growing, and eventually that'd be quite a harvest from one tree. The European hazelnut is recommended above the American or native hazelnuts because they're larger and more resistant to our pests. You don't have to be convinced that a hazelnut is a delicious nut. I'm sure you've all tasted hazelnuts, but you may not have been aware how healthy they are. Rich in monounsaturated fatty acids, rich in dietary fiber, vitamins, minerals, other phytochemicals, folate, vitamin E, B complex vitamins, minerals, all these provided by hazelnuts. So, yes, a question.
With all of these nut trees, any special preparation for the soil when you're planting? I mean, in terms of...
So let's look at the European hazelnut, for example. Grows best in well-drained, loamy soils with regular moisture. Almost everything grows best in well-drained, loamy soils with regular moisture. So that's, you're looking for a good situation. But there are some trees that can actually manage fairly, poor sites and do okay. So you don't really need to be that concerned. I mean, certainly you're going to be concerned with any compaction issues or any extreme texture problems or pH problems and that sort of thing. But if you have your typical soil, if you have a decent loam, you're good to go.
What constitutes a radical pH problem?
Well, most plants prefer pH of between 6 and 7. Now, keeping that in mind, with the Chinese chestnut, very tolerant of highly acid, infertile dry sands. So there you go. If you happen to have that situation, Chinese chestnut's the way to go. Other plants wouldn't do nearly as well in kind of inhospitable conditions like that. So European hazelnut, it's good, it likes standard agricultural areas, but it also does fine on hilly, sloping, or marginal soil that generally can't support most other crops. So here's another versatile species to consider. You do need at least two different individual hazelnut trees and shrubs or trees, whatever you want to call them. And it might be good for them to be different varieties. They'll both be producing for you, but they need to have a different plant to pollinate, and their pollination happens at different times. So here's some lists, and there's so much to think about when you invest in these plants. So that I really recommend that you do some homework or talk to someone who's done their homework. Talk to a nursery that knows about, or find out who's grown these plants successfully and try to learn from them. Birds love mulberry trees, and so do I. But it's not the kind of tree that you're going to get a harvest from. You're not going to bring bushels of mulberries in. They're small berries. It's hard to reach a lot of them because it's a substantial size of this tree. I often just pick up the mulberries that I find on the ground and pop them in my mouth. But you'll get so many birds that come to visit this tree. It's worth it just for that alone, just for the delight of seeing how much they appreciate it. How many of you have tasted a mulberry? Yeah, yeah. And who's ever heard of a Chinese mulberry? I mean, and can you imagine a fruit that tastes like a combination of ripe fig, mulberry, persimmon, and cantaloupe? Well, I guess you can be the first, not only in your block, but maybe even in the state, if you got this one, Chinese mulberry. Again, a tree that needs two for cross-pollination. Persimmon, I can testify about. Now, this is a tree that grows down south in the wild. It also grows as far north as northern Connecticut. But it will grow here, and it will grow just fine here. It's just a matter of you deciding to plant it and then protecting it from other plants. But once it's established, and this is another one of those trees that can do quite well on marginal soil. In fact, that's how it thrives down south. Now, let me testify about persimmons. You might have tasted store-bought persimmons, and if you have bought a persimmon in the store, it's a fairly big fruit, about that size, right? American persimmons are only about that big. You don't want to taste them when they're nice and firm because it'll pucker your mouth. It's terribly astringent at that point. It's not quite ripe. You want to wait until it's nice and wrinkled, soft. And at that point, it's super sweet, unbelievably delicious. That's why they call it Diospyros, fruit of the gods. Diospyros virginiana is the Latin name. And you know just by tasting it, it's very high in vitamin C. It has wonderful nutrition. It's a beautiful tree, the foliage in the fall. So this is one of my favorite fruits in the world, is persimmon. I used to help myself to persimmons when I lived in North Carolina. I'd find that, the trees growing wild. Just remembering what it was like to have an unlimited supply of persimmons. But you too can be a proud owner of persimmon tree. Check out Triple Brook Farm. And there's two P's in the word triple. The plants that I brought today are all from Triple Brook Farm. I work there every Sunday, and he gives me plants in exchange for my labor. So it's in Southampton, and you too can go there just as a pilgrimage to this place, which grows many kinds of bamboo and other exotic plants. And he has persimmon trees. Now, a cherry is certainly an option, but these cherry trees normally grow very tall. The birds will have no trouble reaching them, but you certainly will. And so think about a dwarf cherry tree. And there are a variety of dwarf cherries that are available, the sweet cherry, the lapins, the sweet cherry black tartarian. There's a sour cherry, Prunus cerasus, and which has the best of both worlds, it seems, because it's good for both cooking and eating fresh. 20 to 30 pounds in its 5th year, and it never gets more than 6.5 feet tall. Now, Nanking cherry, how's this for, think about, okay, what do I do now? Okay, it reminds me kind of forsythia, but it has a lot of advantages over forsythia. Forsythia doesn't offer us anything really except for colorful blossoms. Nanking cherry certainly does offer more of those fruits that birds will love, but they'll never eat all of them. They'll leave you plenty. Certainly an appealing plant. And how about this? Imagine looking outside your window and seeing these bush cherries abloom, and then anticipating that when the fruit is ripe, it'll taste almost exactly like cranberries, although a bit sweeter. Joy, Jan, and Joel are the names of some of those varieties of bush cherry. All these species are on my handout, by the way, which you can either get from my website or the library, I think, is going to print them up for you. Quince certainly gives us a lot of beauty, an ornamental tree. And you can eat the fruits, but you can't just take a bite like you can of an apple. You have to cook them. And they're great for preserves because there's a lot of pectin in them. So they're good for helping other fruits to gel. So there's this species, the quince, then there's the flowering quince. You use both fruits the same way.
What's the difference? Is the flowering quince the one that's just like the hedge? Or,
Well, you could have a hedge of flowering quince, but I'm not sure what you mean by it's like the hedge.
there's one that grows like a tree and it's tall, and I believe that there's a quince
Okay.
that grows
Yeah,
smaller.
I think flowering quince would be more like a hedge, yes. Apples are something to think about, but they're difficult to grow here in New England without a lot of pesticides, herbicides, that sort of thing. So to deal with the pests and diseases. So Liberty, Jonafree, and Priscilla are among the breeds, among the varieties that have good disease resistance. And there's some strategies that you can take to try to keep your orchard free of pests and diseases: pruning, keeping the orchard floor clean, and applying a fresh mulch of compost every season. So the healthier the trees are, the better they are at warding off diseases. Here's a fellow, an orchardist in Dartmouth. He plants the mulberry. He also plants spicebush and sassafras, and he says that these trees invite beneficial predators, insect predators, and he's able to grow things like this dessert apple called the Cox's Orange Pippin. Look at the taste he's describing: pear, melon, orange, and mango in that apple. Now we know that European pears need to be picked when they're unripe. Pick before they're ripe, right? And you bring them inside, and then they soften. But as soon as they're ripe, you have to eat them almost immediately, or they'll keep going. They'll keep ripening and go bad on you, even if you put them in the refrigerator. So that's one downside to European pears. Also, there's the question of disease resistance. They might be a little bit more resistant than apples are, but they still have their problems. Think about this variety, though, Magnus pear. Excellent buttery flavor, fire blight resistant. It keeps for 4 months. In that respect, it's much better than most European pears. It does need another pollinizer in order to bear, and it's slow to bear. Think about this one, another pear that has good fire blight resistance. These pears, these sugar or suckle pears, are quite small. They're almost bite-sized, and they're a dessert pear. They're just super sweet, aromatic, and tasty. And they're self-pollinating. You only need one. And they ripen on the tree, which is another thing that's different about them from the typical European pear. And speaking of typical pears, here's one that's not typical at all. In fact, it's a totally different species. You might call it, it might remind you of an apple in terms of shape, but the taste doesn't remind you of anything. It's nice and firm, and there are all kinds of different varieties of Asian pear that you can get. And they are wonderfully disease resistant. So it's an excellent choice for an orchard here in New England, or for a small backyard orchard, Asian pears. You might, I think you do need to pinch off, there's quite a number of flowers here per cluster, and then each one of those is, if they're fertilized, if they're pollinated, each one will form a small fruit, but you don't want all of those to ripen to maturity. So you'll want to pinch off all of them except one from each cluster. Anyone have experience growing peaches? Okay, they're certainly hardy enough for New England, aren't they? Red Haven, I hear, is a wonderful variety. Reliance is another one. And you can't deny that this is an ornamental species. There's just a beautiful tree in the spring. So again, it's great to add value to your property to have trees like this, so that the next owner who wants to purchase the property sees, oh, I'd have fruit trees. That would be a definite plus in your column. American plum and beach plum are small. They are both native plums. They grow in the wild here in America. American plum and beach plum. Beach plum grows on the Cape, and it grows in sandy soil, which is pretty astonishing. So if it can grow there, it can certainly grow on your property, where there's probably a lot more nutrients and water available. You can see the different varieties here, even in color. These are all beach plums at maturity here. And you can see how small they are, but they make wonderful preserves. Juneberry. How many of you have tasted a juneberry? An exquisitely delicious fruit. It's fairly small, smaller than your typical blueberry, but I would say it's tastier than a blueberry. Right now, as you're driving around, you might notice trees that look like this. This is a native tree now with white blossoms in May, and then in June, each of those flowers looks like this. And then in June, watch for the, they're easier to find now because of those white flowers are advertising themselves. But the birds will have no trouble in finding those ripe fruits. Pawpaw, American custard apple. This is from a tropical family of trees, the custard apple family. And it grows wild down south. It grows wild in the Midwest. There are many towns called pawpaw. And many of those towns have pawpaw festivals every year in the fall when the fruits are ripe. What is it about this fruit? It doesn't look very appealing, does it? Just this green thing up in the tree. It never changes color, which you expect good fruits to do. You expect your fruit to change color when it matures. If anything, it might get some brown splotches on the skin, but otherwise, no. And then it'll fall to the ground. So of course, it's got to be ripe if it falls to the ground. You open it up, and there is this delightful custardy pulp that has been described as a combination of every tropical fruit there is: mango, pineapple, melon, berries, you name it. And it really is a delicious fruit. The seeds are not edible, the skin is not edible, but the pulp sure is. This is a fly-pollinated blossom, and you would need 2 pawpaw trees for cross-pollination, at least 2, because it's not going to pollinate itself. And you might have an orchard of trees eventually from those 2, because they will send out runners and propagate themselves if you allow them to. If you don't want them to, just mow them back. So it's a beautiful tree with a delicious fruit, getting to be about, maybe 30 feet tall. And who would have thought that you could grow a hardy orange tree in New England? This is, again, from the Orient, and if it grows there, it can grow here in a similar climate. These trees get to be about 20 feet tall. As you can see, many small oranges about this size, full of seeds, an intense flavored fruit. And what do you do with lemons and limes? Whatever you do with them, you can do the same thing with a hardy orange fruit. I like to add water to my lemons and limes and just make a refreshing drink. And that's exactly what I do with my hardy orange fruits. Now, so there's this tree that grows to 20 feet tall, but then there's this other choice, the dwarf flying dragon, which is called, the dwarf hardy orange, which is called flying dragon hardy orange. And I don't have to tell you that this is an exotic looking tree. This is what it looks like in the winter right here, okay? It's called flying dragon because it has those curved claws like the thorns, and it just has the sinuous growth. What a delightful, with white flowers in the summer, in the spring, and it has reliable harvests every year. You can depend on this plant to give you many of those small oranges. And it is fully hardy. I have to keep, people say, you mean you can plant it outside? Yes. In fact, it wants to be outside. It doesn't want to be indoors. It's not a house plant. Here's a hardy fig that's not quite as hardy as a hardy orange, because if you don't protect this fig tree over the winter, all the branches will die back. And the roots will survive, but then they'll have to start from scratch. And that's no way to treat a tree. You want that tree to keep on going where it left off. So what you can do then is to grow it in a large pot and bring that pot indoors, and then for the winter, and then put it back out in the spring when the danger of frost is past. Or, and this is what the Italians do because they want that fig tree to get big and they love their figs, they'll put that fig tree down by cutting, on the same side every year, cutting the roots back a little bit to make it possible to just lay that tree down, bundle up the branches, and then insulate it, cover it up with dirt or whatever you've got, burlap, leaves, and insulate it from the winter. So it's okay if it gets to be freezing, but it just can't survive like minus 10 degrees, which is what New England winters can dish out. And then you bring it back up in the spring. Autumn olive is an invasive alien that you don't want on your property because it is so, it just spreads amazingly effectively. It is a nitrogen fixing plant. Perhaps you've heard about legumes that can, farmers use legumes as cover crops because they are able to fix nitrogen. Well, that's part of the secret of the invasiveness of this plant. It can do the same thing. It can make, it can make its own fertility, basically. If you find this plant in fruit, and it fruits in the fall, help yourself. They're delicious fruits. They're high in lycopene. You can make a delicious fruit leather out of them, but don't put it on your property. Instead, you want this relative of the autumn olive, which is called gumi or cherry silverberry. And look at the flavor, similar to pie cherries, red or black currants, apples or pomegranate, and has a lot of uses and extremely healthy for you. You might have to cover this with some kind of netting to keep the birds away because the birds also appreciate these fruits. Has anyone tried goji? This is being touted as a superfruit, right? I don't care for them all that much, but if you like them, you can grow them here. I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, a bit of hyperbole here. In fact, WebMD says possible benefits include, and then this whole long list of things that some people say goji is good for. But I can certainly testify that seaberry or Siberian pineapple is definitely a superfruit. If you're in China, you might have a glass of seaberry juice instead of orange juice because that's what they have available. As if one combined fish oil with a multivitamin mineral all in one fruit. This is another nitrogen fixing shrub, by the way, and it's thorny.
So can you just go back for a minute? The bottom says sea buckthorn. Is it the same as a sea buckthorn?
Yes. Sea buckthorn, Siberian, yep, all those are the same name, yep.
And they do grow here.
They do, yep.
It reminds me of bittersweet. Has it got those properties as well?
Bittersweet is a vine.
Okay.
This is not a vine, yeah. Honeyberry is a relative of Lanissera. I'm blanking now. What is that vine that's common in Maryland? It'll come to me. Anyway, these fruits are ripe very early, even before strawberries, and the taste of wild blueberries, then something tangy. So I've never had a pleasure of tasting a honeyberry. I'll just have to trust what the internet says until I have a chance to taste one myself. People do say, though, that it depends entirely on which honeyberry you're tasting. And isn't that true of so many other things? You can have a great blueberry or a so-so blueberry. And same goes for strawberries or anything else. But again, you'll need at least a couple for cross-pollination. And I would say that, judging by this is certainly a superfruit. Honeysuckle is the name I was trying to think of. It's a relative of honeysuckle. Currants and gooseberries. Before I talk about them, let's see if Stow is on the list here. Yes, whoops. Stow is one of the towns where currants and gooseberries are prohibited. And the reason for that is that there's a disease called white pine blister rust disease that currants and gooseberries are a vector for. So that can be problematic to the health of the pine trees. So let's go on. There are plenty of other things you can choose from. American elderberry. I can't think of anything else that would be helpful if you're coming down with a flu or trying to recover from a flu besides elderberry syrup. I think it's a wonderful remedy for the flu. And it's a native shrub. It's a shrub that gets to be pretty tall. Those fruits are pretty strong tasting. How many of you have tasted an elderberry? Okay. So you know that unless you cook it first, you're dealing with a, pretty powerful taste. However, cooking transforms it. And I love elderberry pancakes, for example, putting them in my batter, or muffins, or putting them in my cereal, or, so many things. As soon as you cook them, it transforms the taste. Extremely healthy for you. And the birds will also love them. Now here's an interesting plant that people think of as an ornamental. So people can sometimes, and it's called black chokeberry. I don't even have that common name up here on the slide because I don't want you to think of it as a chokeberry. That kind of makes it sound unappealing, doesn't it? I would prefer to call it aronia. And then that makes it sound, okay, you've got something here. And I agree that if you eat those fruits and pick them off the shrub, they don't taste good at all. So what do? You put them in a plastic bag, put that plastic bag in the freezer, and the next morning they're great. And you can, again, just use them for whatever you use those elderberries for, in your batter or with your hot cereal or your baking, or, In fact, there's a book called A is for Aronia that you can get, just do a search online for A is for Aronia if you're curious about this shrub. And look at this impressive list of things that aronia is good for. So, all those things that it's good for, this is truly a superfruit. Lowbush blueberry is a native plant, but it's not often cultivated. When people grow mulberries, they're usually growing a high bush. And you can visit blueberrycroft.com to find the best varieties. Anyone have experience growing blueberries?
We tried.
You tried.
Everyone failed.
They failed. They didn't even survive? Any idea why?
No.
That's too bad.
It's terribly sad.
Yes, I imagine so. Of course, many people who have blueberries discover that they're growing them for the birds, unless they really are diligent about covering them.
No, there are huge orchards of them right near where we live.
Oh, okay.
They don't like our house.
Well, and you can see how ornamental they are as well. Beautiful in the fall. You can grow cranberries. They don't require a bog. And it's actually a nice ground cover. Lingonberry. Swedes love this because it grows wild in Sweden. And it's unquestionably a superfruit. Rich in omega-3 fatty acids, unsaturated fats, all these other things here. 30 other phenol compounds. And look at this means of preserving lingonberries. Just put them in a jar of water. That is a way to preserve a berry or a fruit. Who ever heard of such a thing? Just put them in a jar of water and let them sit there. Maybe a small amount of sugar at room temperature. Viburnum is appealing to many birds and other wildlife. And they're good for us too, but it's more like a snack, a little treat. You're not going to have bushels of wild raisins. But it's a beautiful, beautiful shrub, different species of viburnum. And now let's talk about raspberries. Here's Anne, which is twice the size of a typical red raspberry and fruits in the fall. Here's Caroline, which gets good press for being delicious and productive and vigorous. Here's Bristol black raspberry. See, these are, black raspberries grow wild here in New England. But if you want to grow them, it makes sense to get a variety that's better than the wild, that has bigger and tastier berries, and this one would be a good choice. Here's a variety of thornless, although I understand that Triple Crown isn't quite hardy here, so Chester might be a better choice here in Stow. And then there's some gourmet strawberries, Mara des Bois, musk. These are small strawberries, but intense tasting. Alpine strawberry, very small, like a wild strawberry. Another small and tasty one is white woodland. So here they all are on a platter. None of these is as big as your typical store-bought or field-grown strawberries. But boy, you go to a French restaurant, they'll serve you one of these, the musk or the Mara des Bois, and that's a real sensation. And then there's something called seascape, ever-bearing, spring and fall. delicious, more of your typical strawberry in terms of size and shape. Hardy kiwi. How many of you have tasted a hardy kiwi? All right, I've got to testify about this one. The first time you taste a hardy kiwi, you're going to say, wow. And then the next thing you're going to say is, why has no one ever given me a hardy kiwi fruit before? It's kind of like, you'll feel deprived. It's like, imagine never having tasted pineapple before, and someone says, oh, here, try some of this. Oh my God, and if it's a really fresh pineapple, that would be a real revelation, wouldn't it? Well, hardy kiwi is kind of like that. I don't even really like store-bought kiwis, but this is a smaller fruit, and you pop it in your mouth. Don't need to worry about a fuzzy skin. And it has a hint of kiwi, but a hint of pineapple and other wonderfully sweet fruits. And it's a vine. It's a very vigorous vine. You need a male and a female. You need the male to pollinate the female. So you need to give them both support. You could let the male climb up into a tree, which is what happens in nature, right? They climb up into trees. But you don't want the female to climb up in a tree because you want to be able to pick the fruits. So you provide a trellis for the female, and a good-sized trellis, because it'll keep growing and growing. Every year it'll get, and you need some patience too, because you won't get those fruits until the 7th year. Okay? And then finally, every year you'll get these wonderful crops of hardy kiwis. So the best time to plant hardy kiwis is 10 years ago, and the next best time is now. So, and this is one of those fruits that permaculture enthusiasts just love. And it certainly is another one of those superfruits. I mean, you can just taste how healthy some of these fruits are. Here's an arbor. Now you can imagine, just like the aronia, people used to grow this because it was ornamental. It was just so beautiful. And they had no idea that they were walking under this delicious fruit. Super hardy kiwi is another variety. It fruits a little bit earlier. It doesn't require quite as much time to reach maturity so that it will fruit. However, and it's ornamental. Look at the variegated foliage. But people say that its taste doesn't quite equal the normal hardy kiwi. I certainly don't need to tell you what a grape is, and I don't have time to discuss all the ins and outs about care and pruning and all that. But there are some wonderful varieties of grape out there. Schisandra, Sandra berry, Chinese magnolia vine. Once again, from the Orient, we have this exotic fruit. Try to imagine now each of these clusters of berries coming from a single flower. How is this possible botanically? I can't even begin to explain. But at any rate, is this a superfruit? Well, I think so. You can understand why Olympic athletes want Sandra berry in their diet, just for this first point alone, and increasing resistance to disease and stress, increasing energy, physical performance and endurance, a mental boost without the jitteriness caused by coffee. The list goes on and on. Even if only a quarter of these are true, and and I think virtually all of them are. In China, they know their herbs, right? They know their natural substances, and this is a highly revered plant in China. Rugosa rose. On the Cape, you'll see it growing in the wild. And it's delicious. It's got vitamin C for sure. And I like just scooping the seeds out and popping one of these in my mouth. You can make rosehip tea if you dry the fruits. You can make preserves. Now let's talk about edible perennial vegetables. And asparagus is just about the only one that comes to most people's minds, the one that you're familiar with that comes back every year. Rhubarb would be another. And that's about it, right? Well, there's a lot more. Ostrich fern, this grows in the wild. And just one of them will give you many. Like any self-respecting perennial, it'll spread. And even though it grows often in shady places out in the wild, and usually near water is where it's found, like in seasonally flooded areas or near a river bank or something. But it doesn't require those conditions. You can grow it in any sunny spot miles from water, and it'll be happy. And they're majestic, beautiful ferns, and every spring they will give you those delicacies called fiddleheads. Jerusalem artichoke or sunchoke looks like a sunflower. It grows very tall, but the flowers are smaller than sunflowers. And it gives you tubers that are edible in the spring, especially. You can eat them raw, you can eat them cooked. And they're quite invasive, just like that I mentioned earlier, the comfrey. You know, you're not going to want to let Jerusalem artichoke anywhere near your garden where it's going to take over. Giant Solomon seal can be eaten like asparagus. Hostas are edible. in Japan, which is where hostas come from, there's a long tradition of eating hostas. And deer will certainly devour them, right?
How do you eat them?
Excuse me?
How do you eat them? Do they get cooked or what?
I would just chop it up and put it in my stir fry.
Any house?
Yep, any hostas. But the younger leaves, as you can imagine, are more appealing than the older. The older leaves are more tough. So you want to get them while they're young. Good King Henry is an edible perennial that's kind of like spinach, like a versatile spinach. Comes from England, as you might guess. Lovage, a tall celery that's a great seasoning as well as a celery, has a real oomph, a real character for the taste, right? You can eat bamboo sprouts, and they fetch a high price in the market for that matter. Chicory can be a perennial. Dandelion is one of my favorite edible vegetables. Just because it's a weed doesn't mean it doesn't deserve attention. As a matter of fact, I would say that because it's really one of my favorite vegetables, I'm really interested in how a variety, if you buy it, the seed commercially, you can probably get a variety that doesn't go to fruit, doesn't go to seed, so go to flower and go to seed so soon. And there's an advantage to that because then you can harvest dandelion into the summer. Great for salads or cooking. And the leaves and the roots of dandelion, again, Chinese herbalists are well acquainted with the virtues of dandelion, especially for the liver.
Any dandelions?
Any dandelion? Sure, any dandelion. Although I'm not interested in picking dandelions from your lawn because they just are so scrawny. And I mean, I want nice, healthy, pampered dandelions. In an organic farm someplace that's had fertile soil for years, right? And that's what I'm on the lookout for. And they have leaves that are, really substantial and dark green and
Could you just take what's in your lawn and
You certainly could.
for a long time?
You certainly could. Yeah. But I would really like so many other things. You're better off, I think, buying the varieties that are already cultivated and bred for excellence. Johnny's Seed Company is one example of that. Here's a wild plant from England growing on the coast. You call that soil? How in the world does it get so lush? Growing on the coast of England, I don't know. But listen to what Mark Williams has to say. I place it on a par with seps, scallops, and truffles in the Parthenon of wild food gods. And he goes on and on, right, about how delicious this thing is and how versatile it is. You can think of it as broccolita. And here's another broccolita, an early broccoli. It's smaller, but mustardy. And another versatile vegetable, Turkish rocket. A climbing spinach. No other perennial edible is anywhere near as productive so early in the season. Doesn't it make sense for us to know about these plants, to acquire them, to propagate them, and make them available to other people? Garden sorrel, a delightfully sour taste, tart and lemony, high in nutrients. Very well known in Europe, used in salads, soups, and stews. Red vein sorrel, it's not quite as tasty, but boy is it ornamental, and so it's good for salads. Groundnut is what kept pilgrims alive the first winter they were here. These tubers on a string, kind of like pearls on a necklace. And they're much more nutritious than potatoes and much tastier as well.
I keep pulling those out like weeds.
Mm-hmm.
I keep pulling them.
Oh yeah, those are weeds, yeah. But probably they don't have substantial sized tubers. Again, you want to get the cultivars that give you the biggest tubers and that aren't competing with other plants. because if they have their own space, then they're going to really they'll really deliver for you. Salsify, I'm trying to grow this year. I'm going to see what happens. Although I'm not quite sure how you can call it a perennial. If you harvest the roots, then there's nothing left. I guess maybe you leave some in the ground, and I'm not quite sure how it works, but it's a versatile vegetable. The leaves are tender with a cucumber-like flavor, excellent in salads. And the roots taste like artichokes. Skirret is another versatile vegetable that's particularly known for its roots. And again, if you harvest some of the roots but leave some in the ground, then it will function as a perennial. Chinese yam, look at the size of that thing. And I've heard that people grow them in garbage cans filled with compost-rich soil so that it's easy to harvest. You just dump it out. Otherwise, I don't know how in the world you're going to dig out a Chinese yam from the soil. And it's a beautiful vine, as you can see. Even these tiny things are edible, the aerial tubers, the aerial potatoes. Mint root, from a mint. So it's a tuber that doesn't have a minty flavor because it's a tuber, not a leaf. So different parts of the plant are very different in terms of flavor. And it's a delicacy in Eastern cuisine. As you can see, apple, globe artichoke, new potatoes, and water chestnuts are all part of that mixture of flavors for Chinese artichoke or mint root. And it looks kind of ornate too, doesn't it? Like a seashell. Egyptian onion walks around your garden because at the top of each of these stalks are bulblets that then sprout themselves. And then they create more bulblets that also sprout. And after a while, that thing's just going to bend over and plant itself. You could now be feasting on Egyptian onions because it's a spring onion. If you had them in your garden, you could be harvesting them now, both for the bulbs and for the leaves and stalks. And here's another spring onion. I love this one, Welsh onion or spring onion. The flavor is so mild that you don't want them to cook. If you're using them in a cooked dish, you add them at the very last minute because cooking any longer than that will kind of rob them of their flavor. Pollinators love them. Bees flock to this plant. They seed themselves wildly, and they also propagate themselves laterally. You know, the bulbs just multiply. Multiplier onions, speaking of which, are perennials. So are chives. So are garlic or Chinese chives. Here's another oriental species. Look at the versatility of them. Leaves, stems, flower stems. All the different ways you can use them.
These spread too, right? I think I have these, and they just.
Oh yes, they can spread, absolutely. And
They're hard to remove if you don't want them.
that's hard to get rid of them once you've got them, that's for sure. But not impossible. I mean, if you really wanted to get rid of something, you could chop them all down and then do the sheet mulch approach. Okay, starting from scratch, they won't survive. Garlic is another perennial. If you leave them in the ground, they'll keep coming back. One of my favorites, wild leek or ramps. I don't think there's any onion in the world that tastes as good as this one. Exquisite taste. And the French chefs certainly agree with me. In fact, they pay such high prices for these wild leeks that they're overpicked in many areas of our country from being provided to these high-priced restaurants. But you can grow them yourself and make many. You know, each one, again, will give you many over the years.
So if you harvest the bulb, then.
If you harvest the bulb, then that's it.
Right.
So instead, you let them produce many copies of themselves. The bulbs will spread. And then, once you have plenty, well, why not help yourself? Because all the ones that are still there will continue to multiply. Anise hyssop is a mint that, so yes, you can eat the flowers and you can eat mint, you can drink mint tea, but it's also there to attract beneficial insects and even hummingbirds. Has a delightful scent, like mint and licorice scented. Bee balm is another one to attract honey. Anything that has red flowers is bound to attract hummingbirds. This is one of my favorite flowers because of the variety of pollinators that it attracts. You'll find insects hovering over these flowers that you didn't even know existed. All these exotic wasps and that sort of thing. Thousands of visits by pollinators each season. And all these other deer resistant. Deer are certainly not going to want to eat this mint. And repels mosquitoes. How about that? Culinary thyme. Think about growing a ground cover of culinary thyme. So wild ginger is another ground cover that does just fine in the shade. Doesn't need sunlight. And it truly is a wild ginger. It was used as seasoning by Native Americans, and they used it to treat cold and fevers. So, my plate, my planet. Think about our government now, USDA, and the Health and Human Services Department both put out this study last year agreeing that the less meat and animal products and the more plant products that we have in our diets, we will be better off, our health will be better off, and the planet will be better off. Okay, certainly the factory farms aren't doing us any favors, right? And there's such a huge carbon footprint involved with raising that livestock. So instead, let's go for these wonderful crops that care for the earth, fair share, care for people. These are the permaculture principles. There's no reason why everyone on this planet can't have all the nourishing food that they need if everything is done, with fairness and with common sense. We only have one planet, so I appreciate what everyone here has been doing and will be doing on into the future to make sure we have a planet that can be passed on to future generations. So, thank you very much. I don't remember, did I ever turn this on, or was it on?